Hello, everyone. We're looking at the religious problems that were taking place in 1559 today, and our objective is to look at what the major religious problems were when Elizabeth first became queen in the year 1559. Now, before we get started, we need to familiarize ourselves with a few key terms. We're going to do a little bit of a recap of our last lesson before we move into the 7 major religious problems that she is going to face. Before we get on to that, let's look at a prayer book, a communion service, and a doctrine. So the prayer book, it was a book containing prayers that would be used in church services, kind of like a Bible. It would be like a cheat sheet, if you will, for all the prayers that you would need to know in any religious service. The communion service offers the bread and wine in a congregation, and the bread and wine were symbolic of the body and blood of Christ. These were things that not all groups within England agreed on. Again, some would say that the communion service isn't necessary, while others would say that it is. And the communion service was something that Catholics were very in favor of, while Protestants and Puritans not so much. And a doctrine, think of a doctrine as rules. It's the principles of the religious belief. It's the things that you need to do if you want to take part in that specific religion. And Catholics, Protestants, and Puritans had their own religious doctrines. I'm going to go back and have a quick recap of the monarchs so far. So again, if we look on our timeline, 1509, 1547, 53, and 58, we should be able to put Henry VIII becoming king in 1509, Edward VI in 1547, Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, in 1553, and of course Elizabeth I, she became queen in 1558, but she wasn't coronated until 1559. And that's one of the little confusions that we often see. Elizabeth was named queen in 1558, but she assumed power not long after, when the calendar year changed to 1559. Now, matching up the images, of course, Henry VIII, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Now, trying to remember the religions of each is a little bit tricky, but remember what we talked about, how it goes from Catholic to Protestant, Catholic, again, back to Protestant. So just a little refresh for us before we move into today's context. So remembering we had Henry changing from Catholic, he became more Protestant. Edward was strictly Protestant. Mary, of course, is Catholic. And Elizabeth is in this middle ground. And we do call that middle ground the middle way. This is Via Media. So she's not going to become a Protestant like Edward, but she's certainly not going to be a Catholic like Mary. She has to find somewhere in the middle that everybody is going to be happy with. And this is going to be one of the problems Elizabeth will find, is how do I keep everybody happy when I have 2 very distinct sides in England who don't like each other? So we've got 3 questions to consider here. The first is, why were people so angry with the constant change in religion? The second is, what did Protestants do when Mary I became queen? And lastly, why did Elizabeth make the choice to use a middle way approach? So now's the time for you to think about what we talked about last lesson. Remember the context and what we just discussed a few moments ago. Pause the video and have a think about each. When you're ready, then it's time to hit play and we'll take them up together. Great, so we've all had a chance to have a quick think. Let's look at the first question. Why were people so angry with the constant change in religion? We needed to make sure we're going back to religion being the most important element of people's lives. And everything was explained through religion, why the sun rose and set, why it rained, why there were drought, why people became ill. This was the most important thing to people. And if religion changed, their whole world would change. Also, going to a new church was really confusing. You spent your whole life learning the ins and outs of going to the Catholic Church, for example. If it suddenly becomes a Protestant church, well, you're not going to know how that church operates. And lastly, the loyalty to religion was the only way to ensure that you could actually get into heaven. If you were born as a Catholic, you needed to remain a Catholic, and you needed to die as a Catholic to be able to get into heaven. The second question, what did Protestants do when Mary I became queen? We know that they left, and many went to Geneva and Switzerland for safety. It was there that they studied Protestantism further. John Calvin was a very famous Protestant preacher in Geneva at the time, and their faith grew much stronger as they waited patiently to return to England. They knew that Mary won't be queen forever, and at some point they will have the opportunity to come back to England. And lastly, why did Elizabeth choose the middle way? She knew that people wouldn't accept another change in faith. but she also knew that she had to be a good Protestant and push for the Protestant faith to be the dominant one in England. She didn't want any civil war to erupt, and she didn't want war to happen with any other country. France and Spain were the two biggest superpowers of the time, and they were both Catholic countries. And lastly, the new church would be mostly Protestant, but just Catholic enough to keep everybody happy. A little bit of context here. The English population we know was really frustrated by the constant change in religion, and when Mary I died, there was another division happening within the country. Catholics were really sad that their Catholic queen had passed away, but Protestants were really happy because now they had an opportunity where Elizabeth could assume the throne and, as a Protestant, restore their faith in England. So Elizabeth had to act really quickly. What she had to do was make a new church before the Protestants wanted revenge and rebelled against her, because these Protestants might feel as though they were abandoned under the rule of Mary and no one was trying to help them. In doing so, they might be angry and they might act out towards Elizabeth. She also had to show the Catholics that she would consider their interests and allow them to keep some elements of their faith. Now, this would be known as Via Media, also known as the Middle Way approach. Now, not everyone was keen on this. Some Puritans, they wrote newspaper articles about Elizabeth, making fun of her, saying that her idea, wasn't very clever. It wasn't showing strong leadership. While small groups of Catholics took to force, and there were a few different rebellions we're going to talk about in detail that will show that Catholics were willing to use violence to try to eliminate Elizabeth and put another Catholic queen on the throne. So as we said, Elizabeth has 7 main religious problems, and she's going to have to sort each of these out. Now we're going to look at each of these problems, and we're going to ask why it was a problem for Elizabeth. Now we know that historians like to talk about the what, but it's really important that they explain why things happened. So the first one, Elizabeth is a Protestant. Why is this a problem for her? Well, she can't allow the Pope to be in charge because that would make her a Catholic. But she knows that the country won't accept her authority. So she's really between a rock and a hard place now. She can't put the Pope back in charge because all the Protestants will be angry with her. But she can't declare herself in charge of the church because the Catholics won't like her. So again, Elizabeth needs to use this via media, the middle way, to try and find common ground between both sides. So now's a chance to look at the remaining 6 and try to think in your head, why might this be a problem for Elizabeth? We'll read through them quickly and then you can pause the video as you have a few moments to yourself. So most of England is Catholic, but most of Elizabeth's government is Protestant, asking yourself, why is this a problem? Most other countries in Europe are actually Catholic, so Spain, France. Religious changes in the past have caused rebellions. Mary, Queen of Scots, she was around in Scotland at the time. She claims that she's actually the rightful Queen of England. Why is this a problem for Elizabeth? Elizabeth wanted peace. She didn't want to hurt anyone. Why is this going to be an issue for her? And lastly, there needs to be a church that most people will accept. Again, trying to figure out why this is a problem for Elizabeth. So pause the video, have a few moments to think, and when you're ready, we'll hit play and we'll go through what some of the potential answers could be. Good, so we've had a few moments to think. Let's look at the first one here. Most of England is Catholic and most of her government is Protestant. This is going to be a bit of an issue for Elizabeth because most people don't like her, but her government does. Now, if Elizabeth acts too leniently towards the Catholics, her Protestant government might renounce her and might say, we don't want to work with you any longer. We're going to depose you and put someone stronger in power. Most other countries in Europe are actually Catholic. This is a big issue for her because if Elizabeth starts to persecute Catholics in England, she's going to get a poor reputation. And countries like Spain and France might not want to trade any goods with her, harming the English economy. Religious changes in the past have caused rebellion. Again, the majority of the country doesn't like Elizabeth. Would her soldiers even defend her if there was an uprising? Because we have to remember, soldiers in the army might have their own religion. They might be Catholic or they might be Protestant. And if they are a Catholic, they might decide not to fight for Elizabeth, but actually against her. Mary, Queen of Scots, says that she's the rightful queen in England. Well, most Catholics in England would have liked Mary, Queen of Scots to have taken charge, and this was some of the inspiration behind the Catholic plots to actually kill Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth wanted peace. She didn't want to hurt anyone. Her kindness could be mistaken as weakness. She didn't want to be like Mary I or Edward VI, where they were killing Protestants or where they were burning them. She didn't want to do that. She wanted to make sure that she was going to set herself apart from the other monarchs. She couldn't be too nice, but she also couldn't be too harsh. Again, she's stuck between this rock and a hard place, and she thinks that Via Media, going the middle way, is going to be the best solution. And lastly, there needs to be a church that most people will accept. It was already clear that not many people are going to be happy with any kind of religious compromise. The Catholics want to be Catholic, and the Protestants want to be Protestant. And they're not going to go down without a fight, if you want to say, in terms of sacrificing any elements of their religion to take on elements of another. Okay, time for a bonus facts. Elizabeth was really defiant. She never got married. Now, all the time that she was king, Parliament was really pushing Elizabeth to get married and to have children. And this was simply because if she died, they needed to have a clear heir to the throne and someone who was going to be in charge next. It would also secure that England would be a Protestant country because if Elizabeth had a son or a daughter, they would be raised as a Protestant. They would become the next monarch in England, continuing the Protestant faith in the country. Now, Elizabeth never got married. She feared that if she did find a husband, that she would lose some of the power within her kingdom. For example, if she married a prince in Spain, well, the prince of Spain would then become the king of England, a co-ruler with Elizabeth. And she didn't want this to happen. So Elizabeth very famously said that she's married to her country. She's married to England. And this was much to the dismay of her advisors. Many of the English didn't actually have a clue what was going on. Now, if you lived in London, down in this area, you would have known that in 1559 Elizabeth became the Queen, you would have known that she was Protestant, and you may have even seen a painting of her somewhere. But if you lived in a more rural area, let's say in the Midlands or into the north of England, you might not even know that Mary had died, and you might not even know that Elizabeth was now queen. Remember, this is before the days of texting and Wi Fi where you could send a message instantaneously. And if you lived in an extremely remote, small village that never had any visitors, even as people traveled, let's say from London up to Edinburgh, that news might not make it into your village. So some people who lived in very remote areas wouldn't have even known that they had a new queen. Right, so that's it for our lesson today. Please have a look on Show My Homework and complete the quiz and any other tasks set by your teacher.